Take 5. 5 questions to authors and artists. With a common question, we get a personal perspective on what shapes their views. Welcome to Audiobook Radio.
Thank you.
And we do a slot where we ask the same 5 questions to each author, called Take 5. So our first question is there a book or even books that inspired you to write?
Oh, there's so many. Because I was raised by a single mother, and honestly, books were my best friend for many, many years, and they have inspired me. What I can say is my reading list has always been quite eclectic. So I do read books written by Middle Eastern authors, Eastern philosophers, as well as Western novelists. I like to combine different genres, different cultures. That's how I read. So from the very beginning, I would say, of course, Charles Dickens, of course, Don Quixote, yeah, in Spanish, in Spain. It had a huge impact on me when I read it, and then I went back to it. But also 1001 Nights. So all of these things, and of course Russian literature as I grew up, in my early youth, Russian literature had a huge impact on me, and I would say Sufi mystical poetry as well. I combine very, very different sources of knowledge.
It's kind of whet my appetite. I feel like I want to get back to reading things. You mentioned, it sounded like a lonely childhood. So was that, therefore, books were the characters that kind of peopled and kept you sort of sustained?
Yes, and I think one impact it had on me was because I thought my life was so boring. Yeah, I started writing with diaries, keeping a diary, a journal. But because I thought my life was so boring, I thought I had nothing to write about myself, about my daily life. And I wasn't interested in writing about myself. So normally in a diary you would say, today I did this and that, today I saw so and so. That wasn't my interest. What really intrigued me was the ability to be someone else. From the very beginning, I started writing about people who didn't exist and things that had not happened, even as I was keeping a journal. That's why from journals to short stories, it was a very short leap, and from short story into the genre of the novel, where I felt much more comfortable. And ever since then, I've been consistently writing novels.
It just sounds like such fantastic training. You couldn't have a better sort of almost a school and entry level,
Yeah.
So can I ask, is there any book you wish you'd written?
There are, of course there are. Sometimes, not sometimes, many times. When I read a very, very good novel, and I think many writers are the same. You feel jealous, you say good for you, you say I wish I had written this. Of course that's very human, very natural, and I also tweet about this. Sometimes I say, look, I've read this novel, I wish I had written this novel. The writer has all my admiration. I think we should be open about such feelings.
Yeah, totally. And what was the last time? Can you think of the last book you read that you just...
Well, yes, when I read White Tiger. I was like, I love that book, and I was, I said, I wish I had written it.
Yeah, quite. And are there any books that you would love read to you? Do you like the idea of people reading to you?
I like to read on my own, but that said, the way words are combined with sounds, human voice, that is interesting. There's an interesting energy there. Not every writer is a storyteller. Not every writer wants to be a storyteller. When I say storyteller, I think there's an amazing culture, oral culture, especially in the non-Western world, particularly transferred by women from grandmothers to granddaughters. And this huge oral heritage, you can draw upon that. You can learn so many stories from that tradition. And then you can tell these stories, sometimes on stage as a storyteller. Or you can tell them on paper, again as a storyteller. But you know instinctively that you have tapped into an ancient and universal source of creativity and imagination which is beyond you and bigger than you. So that kind of feeling is something that comes with me. That's why I like to listen to stories as much as I like to read stories on my own.
Yeah, totally. Do you find it a little bit promiscuous? Do you feel unfaithful when you're having somebody read a story? You know, that sort of ménage à trois, like instead of having the direct intimacy between the writer and you, the reader, you've got this other person who's reading.
You know, I think the main connection is between the text and the reader. I think as writers, our personalities are not that important. And again, as writers, I'm not sure we're very much aware of what we're doing. You know, on the surface, it looks like we know what we're doing, and all the book jackets, of course, have one name on them, the writer's name. But in fact, the writing process can be very irrational. You have a vague idea about what you're doing, but that doesn't mean that you know where you're going. That doesn't mean that you know what the characters are going to do 6 pages later, or how the story is going to evolve. So I think a writer should allow the story surprise her or surprise him. I have readers who are amazingly avid readers who know my books much better than I do. Or they can analyze the layers upon layers that I'm not even aware of. And I have a lot of admiration, a lot of respect for that kind of, reading. Very, very careful, attentive, but also loving, but also critical. So for me, the main relationship, the main connection is between the reader and the text. And there's a point in which the author has to take a step back.
And do you think there's anything that doesn't belong between the covers of a book? Any subject, any content, anything at all?
I think everything. We can write about everything. We can write about anything. I think the general tendency is to attribute a function to fiction. People say, okay, I'm going to read this book and I'm going to learn something about Afghanistan. The writer is going to tell me. The writer is going to be the representative of that culture. So there's a lot of expectation built in that way, which I find very dangerous, because then non-Western authors are reduced to their identity, national identity or religious identity. One of my books could be about a Turkish woman. Maybe I'm going to write the next book about a Norwegian gay professor, and the next one is going to take part in Siberia. Why not? Why can't we move across boundaries, centuries, cultures? Because imagination, if we really truly believe that imagination knows no boundaries, then why do we impose this much identity politics onto writers, particularly writers who are not from Western capitals?
I totally agree with what you're saying, but you must also recognize on a, as you correctly identified it, as identity politics, because inevitably the English language dominates the world of literature. And in order to get translated, or in order to have some kind of impact on an international stage, I only can read in English. And if I'm going to pick up a novel from an Afghan author which has been translated, I want to know about Afghanistan. Now, I know that a Norwegian gay professor could also be writing about Afghanistan, and I know all that. But at the same time, the level of authenticity, if I have a choice between the Norwegian writing about Afghanistan and the Afghan writing about Afghanistan, I'm obviously going to choose that. And unless I have some kind of appetite or some kind of understanding of Afghani literature, it is really unlikely that I'm ever going to be able to encounter the Afghan writer writing about something else, just because of publishers. And just, to be honest, it's not even on the publishing level. It's a far greater political climate which dictates that.
Of course, I understand, and I respect that. But allow me to say this. The very fact that one person is from, let's say, Morocco or from Turkey doesn't mean that that person represents the soul of Turkey or understands the spirit of Turkey, if there is such a thing. This is everybody has their own personal experiences. Like if you ask about Turkey to different Turkish authors, you will get different responses because people experience it differently. But sometimes an outsider or somebody who's living on the threshold, for instance, somebody who's not Turkish but has been living in Turkey or has felt connected to Turkey, can give you even a better perspective. What I'm trying to say is the depth of our perspective cannot be confined to our national identities. I had the delight and the honor of being on the independent international jury, sitting on the judging panel this year, and one of the things that was very, very interesting for me, and I believe for the other jury members as well, was to see, for instance, an Argentinian writer writing about post-Napoleonic Germany, a novel that takes place in post-Napoleonic Germany, or a Spanish writer writing a novel taking place in Ireland. There's this shift already going on. It is when it comes to the Muslim world that we become more restricted in our imagination, because many people think it's an enclosed world. It's not an enclosed world. So we should allow writers coming from that part of the world to make such shifts if this is what they wish to do. Yeah?
No, I understand that. Tell me, one thing that came out of the Independent Literary Prize talk that you gave at the London Book Fair was both you and your fellow judge seemed to suggest that there wasn't enough strong works being translated, and that maybe publishers were, I don't know how, making their selection, but it was almost as if that selection was somehow limiting. Obviously it has to be limited by the number of books, but do you think there is, like with your experience, whether it be Turkey, Morocco, do you think there are a lot of writers that just never filter to the top, that just don't ever get opportunities to translate when really they should, that they are particularly talented? Do you think that's the case?
What I experienced, again, with this jury process was really there were amazingly strong novels, and our job was very, very tough as we reduced the long list to a short list. So in all fairness, there were really beautifully written, strong novels. However, I understand what you're saying, and there is truth in it, in the sense that publishers can not be, and we need to discuss the reasons why, but they can't be very courageous, They don't pick up very experimental books or books that are daring in different ways in terms of style, in terms of content. So they tend to be conservative. They think they know what works and they repeat the same pattern. Certainly there are writers all over the world, and poets and short story writers, in addition to novelists, who have not been translated well enough, although they definitely deserve it. I mean, one example that Boy Tonkin gave yesterday at the panel was really striking, given this country's historical ties with India. It is very difficult to understand how come writers write from India, but writing in different dialects throughout the continent, they are not being translated into English well enough and fast enough. There's a huge discrepancy there. I'm not talking about writers who are of Indian origin but writing in English. They have their own market, which is a growing market, certainly. But what about the others? Do we hear their voices? Do we read their work? And they have massive followers and readers in their homelands, but the rest of the world doesn't read them in the English language. So that kind of cultural and literary gap, I think, is worrisome.
One final question, which you've actually touched on. In the days before print, would you have been a storyteller?
I think I would. In my heart, I am that storyteller. We would sit around the fire at night, under the stars, and one of us would tell a story, and then someone else would tell a story, and then someone else, and the story would belong to all of us. Nobody would necessarily claim ownership of the story. You wouldn't necessarily put your name on it. You would know that it belongs to humanity. and you just let your words out into space. It just goes freely into the sky. That kind of storytelling is something that's very, very dear to me.
Yes, it sounds absolutely wonderful. I'd love to be around a campfire with you.
Yeah.
Elif Shafak, thank you so much.
Thank you so
really
much.
Appreciate it.
Pleasure.